My grandfather's oak, planted in 1965, stood like a sentinel at the edge of our family's land. Its sprawling branches shaded my childhood summers, and its roots traced the boundary of our property. When Karen Davis, my neighbor with a knack for meddling, claimed the tree was on HOA land, I thought it was a misunderstanding. It was. The trouble began with a letter from the HOA, demanding I cut down the oak for encroaching on an easement by the creek that ran through my property. I dug out Grandpa's faded property sketch from 1998, paired with a county survey proving the tree was mine. I emailed scans to the HOA expecting an apology. Instead, Karen doubled down. She started hammering rebar posts for a fence along the creek, blocking my access to the water. The fence wasn't just ugly, it was illegal, crossing the boundary line by 6 feet. I knocked on Karen's door, survey in hand. "This is my land," I said, pointing to the map. "The oak stays and your fence needs to go," she smirked, arms crossed. "The HOA says otherwise, you'll see." I didn't back down. I hired Elliot, a lawyer who specialized in property disputes, to draft a cease and desist letter. He confirmed the oak and creek were mine, citing the survey and deed. I sent the letter certified mail, complete with the documents. That should have ended it. It didn't. 2 days later, I found an HOA notice nailed to the oak's trunk threatening $500 fines unless I removed the tree. The nail left a raw wound in the bark, sap dripping like blood. I called Elliot, who advised documenting everything. Then Karen escalated. She called the sheriff, claiming I was trespassing on her easement by the creek. Deputy Rogers arrived, a lanky man with a clipboard and a skeptical squint. I handed him the survey, deed, and Elliot's letter. He skimmed them, then turned to Karen, who stood on her porch, hands on hips. "Ma'am," he said, "the tree and this land belong to him. You're on the wrong side of the line. Have a pleasant day." Karen's face tightened, but she said nothing. Rogers tipped his hat and left. I thought that was the end. But as Karen retreated into her house, her eyes burned with something darker than frustration. "This isn't over," she muttered, barely audible. I should have known better than to underestimate her. The oak still stood, but Karen's defiance was a spark, and sparks start fires. I braced myself for what came next, determined to protect Grandpa's tree and the land it anchored. 2 weeks after Deputy Rogers shut down Karen's claims, I came home to a war zone. Someone had carved HOA into the trunk of my grandfather's oak, the raw gashes oozing sap. My fence along the creek was sliced in 3 places, wire ends curling like broken springs. Tire marks gouged the mud near the easement, and one of my beehives lay in ruins, frames splintered, honey seeping into the grass. Worst of all, Pixel, my border collie, yelped after stepping on a nail board hidden by the fence line. The vet cleaned her paw, prescribed antibiotics, and charged me $200. I was done playing defense. Karen had crossed a line, and I wasn't letting her get away with it. I ordered 4 motion sensor cameras, each rigged to ping my phone every 10 seconds until I silenced them. I mounted them on the oak, the barn, and 2 fence posts, covering every angle of the property. Then I hired Nora Beltran, a licensed surveyor with a no-nonsense reputation. She arrived with a theodolite and a stack of fluorescent stakes, marking my property's corners with precision. She also nailed laminated placards to each stake, warning that tampering with survey monuments was a crime, punishable by fines and jail time. I hoped the cameras and stakes would deter Karen, but I wasn't surprised when they didn't. At 1:13 a.m., my phone buzzed with alerts. The live feed showed 2 figures in hoodies skulking near the creek. One yanked Nora's stakes from the ground, tossing them into the water with a splash. The other wielded bolt cutters, snipping my repaired fence. Moonlight caught the shorter figure's platinum blonde hair, Karen, unmistakable even in grainy night vision. The taller one's face flashed briefly. Chandler, a local troublemaker known to Deputy Rogers from past run-ins. That footage was the truth I'd been waiting for. I called Rogers at 6 a.m., uploading the video to a secure link. "I've got Karen and Chandler on camera vandalizing my property," I said. He didn't hesitate. By 7 a.m., he had a warrant for criminal mischief and trespassing. He and two deputies knocked on Chandler's door, catching him in pajama pants, bolt cutters still in his garage. Body cam footage later showed him stammer, "I was asleep all night." Rogers held up a still from my camera, Chandler mid-grimace cutting my fence. Karen wasn't as smooth. Rogers found the stolen stakes in her garage, along with a can of spray paint matching the red streaks on my no trespassing signs. She claimed Chandler stored tools there without her knowledge, but the footage told a different story. Karen made bond by noon, but Chandler, on probation for a 2021 check fraud scheme, was held without bond pending a hearing. The oak scars were fresh, and Karen was still free for now. I knew she'd come for the tree again, but this time I had evidence, and the law was on my side. With Chandler locked up and Karen out on bond, I thought the fight for my grandfather's oak might finally ease. I was wrong. The battle was about to get bigger and dirtier. My lawyer Elliot suggested we dig into the HOA's finances to trace the $3,500 gate Karen had illegally installed across my creek easement. What we found was a bombshell, a cashier's check signed by Chandler drawn from the HOA's reserve account. Elliot pushed further, subpoenaing records that revealed Chandler, the HOA's bookkeeper, had written checks totaling $46,900 for grounds improvements that never existed. The gate was just one piece of his scam. The HOA board was stunned. They trusted Chandler's ledgers, never suspecting fraud. At an emergency meeting, they voted unanimously to press charges against him. Detective Miriam Page from the county's white-collar crime unit took over. She seized Chandler's home computer and uncovered a digital trail, forged receipts for non-existent landscaping, fake meeting minutes approving the gate, and a Word template for neon green approval stamps used on sham invoices. Most damning, $10,000 had been funneled into Karen's personal account, labeled as consulting fees for projects that never happened. Karen lawyered up fast, hearing James Hall, a defense attorney who charged $600 an hour and dodged every question. But Chandler was in deeper trouble, facing new felony charges for theft and forgery, plus a probation revocation from his 2021 fraud case. He was desperate. Detective Page offered him a deal: testify against Karen and the DA might reduce his sentence. Chandler took it, spilling details about Karen's role. He claimed she'd orchestrated the gate scheme to seize my easement, including the oak, for the HOA's expansion. The vandalism, cutting my fence, carving the tree, was her idea to intimidate me into compliance. Elliot and I met with Page to review the evidence. The camera footage from my property, showing Karen and Chandler tossing survey stakes into the creek, tied them to the criminal mischief charges. The financial records and Chandler's testimony linked them to the HOA fraud. Page warned that Karen's lawyer would fight hard, but the case was solid. "She's not slipping out of this," Page said, tapping the stack of forged receipts. The oak's carved scars were starting to heal, new bark forming over the HOA etching. I reinforced the fence and checked the cameras daily, half expecting Karen to try something bold before her trial. She didn't, but her absence felt like the calm before a storm. The HOA sent me a letter of apology, promising to remove the gate and restore my creek access. It was a small win, but the tree still stood in the crosshairs of Karen's schemes. Chandler's testimony was our ace, and I hoped it would be enough to protect the oak for good. For now, I kept my guard up, knowing the courtroom would decide the real fallout. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Chandler, pale and fidgeting in a wrinkled suit, took the stand and laid bare Karen's scheme. He testified that she'd masterminded a plan to annex my land, including my grandfather's oak, for the HOA's community expansion. She promised him a cut of the new property's value. In exchange, he forged HOA checks, funneled cash to her account, and joined her in vandalizing my property, carving the tree, cutting my fence, and tossing survey stakes into the creek. His voice cracked as he recounted Karen's orders, her insistence that I'd back down once the oak was gone. The prosecutor sealed the case with my camera footage. The grainy video played on a courtroom screen. Karen and Chandler at 12:47 a.m. loading rebar into her SUV, stakes glinting under moonlight. The jury watched Karen's blonde hair flash as she heaved a stake into the creek. Gasps rippled through the room. The evidence was undeniable: financial records, forged receipts, and Chandler's testimony painted a clear picture of conspiracy and theft. After 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned, guilty on all counts. Karen and Chandler faced felony charges of conspiracy, theft, and criminal mischief, plus misdemeanor trespassing. Karen's bond was revoked, and the judge sentenced her to 18 months in prison, with $32,000 in restitution to me for property damage and $46,900 to the HOA for the stolen funds. A 5-year no-contact order barred her from contacting me, effective even after her release. Chandler received 4 years with parole eligibility in 2, plus an 18-month sentence for violating his 2021 probation. As Karen was led away, I caught her eye and offered a small wave, not out of spite but as a quiet marker of closure. The oak stood untouched, its scars knitting together under new bark. With the trial behind me, I used the first restitution payment to repair my beehives, the bees buzzing back to life. Pixel, fully healed from the nailboard incident, chased squirrels under the tree's shade. I started planning a greenhouse near the oak, sketching a simple frame to grow tomatoes and basil. The creek, now free of Karen's gate, flowed clear again, and I walked its banks daily, savoring the reclaimed land. Elliot, my lawyer, called to confirm the HOA had dismantled the gate and was auditing its books to prevent future fraud. The board's new chair sent a formal apology, promising transparency. It felt like a turning point, not just for me, but for the community Karen had manipulated. The oak, once a target, now symbolized resilience, its roots deeper than her schemes. As I hammered the first greenhouse post into the soil, I knew this was more than a win. It was a new beginning, one where the land, the tree, and I could finally thrive. The dust of the trial settled, and my grandfather's oak stood prouder than ever, its scars fading beneath fresh bark. With Karen in prison and Chandler locked away, I felt the weight of the past year lift. The land was mine again, the creek flowed freely, and Pixel bounded through the fields, her paw long healed from the nailboard. But peace, I'd learned, was never guaranteed. It had to be built, so I got to work. The HOA, under new leadership, was desperate to clean up its reputation after Chandler's fraud. A week after the sentencing, I received a letter from the board, signed by the new chair, Linda Tran. It was a formal apology for Karen's actions and the HOA's failure to oversee Chandler's bookkeeping. Enclosed was a check for $4,500, drawn from Chandler's frozen bank account to cover the damage to my beehives and fence. Linda also invited me to a board meeting to discuss restorative steps. I wasn't one for meetings, but Elliot, my lawyer, urged me to go. "Show them you're not Karen," he said. "Set the tone." The meeting was held in the community center, a low brick building with flickering fluorescence. The board, 5 new faces, all visibly nervous, thanked me for exposing the fraud. They outlined plans for an independent audit and stricter financial oversight. Then Linda asked for my input on the easement dispute. I kept it simple: remove Karen's gate permanently, honor my survey, and leave the oak alone. They agreed unanimously, and by the next week, a crew dismantled the rebar gate, hauling it away in a rusted pickup. The creek bank looked open and alive again, wild grasses reclaiming the scarred earth. With the HOA's check, I rebuilt the beehives, ordering new frames and a fresh colony. The bees took to the oak's shade, their hum a quiet soundtrack to my days. I also broke ground on the greenhouse I'd sketched during the trial. Using cedar posts and reclaimed glass, I built it just beyond the oak's canopy, where the soil was rich and the creek's mist kept things damp. I planted tomatoes, basil, and a row of lavender for the bees. Pixel watched from the grass, tail thumping, as I drove the final stake, fluorescent like Nora, but this time for growth, not defense. The land felt like a fresh start, but I stayed vigilant. Karen's no-contact order was ironclad, but her influence lingered in whispers among old neighbors who'd backed her. I kept the cameras running, their red lights blinking in the dark. Elliot warned that restitution payments, $32,000 to me, $46,900 to the HOA, would trickle in slowly, tied to Karen's prison wages and Chandler's seized assets. Still, the first check, $1,200, arrived from the state's victim fund. I used it to buy a new fence, this one steel with a lockable gate by the creek. Then came an unexpected twist. A letter arrived from Elaine Castor, claiming to be Corinne's cousin and legal heir. She demanded a right-of-way across my land, citing a deed that granted her access to the creek and, by extension, the Oaks Corner. The letter's tone was pure Corinne, smug, entitled, and vague on details. My gut said it was a bluff, a last-ditch attempt to stir trouble. I called Elliot, who pulled the county records overnight. No such deed existed. The survey and title from 1998 were airtight. I invited Elaine to meet at my house, partly to gauge her nerve, partly to shut this down face to face. She arrived in a sleek sedan, her hair dyed the same platinum blonde as Corinne's. Over coffee I let her talk, her story unraveling with every sentence. She claimed Corinne had signed over the right-of-way before prison but couldn't produce the deed. Elliot joined via Zoom, his calm voice cutting through her bluster. He presented the title report and survey, proving her claim was baseless. Elaine's smile faltered. "This is a misunderstanding," she stammered, gathering her purse. "I'll consult my lawyer." She withdrew her claim 2 days later before a court hearing could expose her. Elliot suspected she'd forged the letter herself, hoping to extort a settlement. It was a fleeting threat, but it reminded me to stay sharp. The oak, the greenhouse, the bees, they were worth protecting. As spring warmed the air, I walked the land daily, checking the greenhouse's sprouts and the oak's new leaves. The restitution checks, though small, kept coming. The bees thrived, and Pixel chased rabbits through the lavender. The HOA's reforms took root. Linda sent updates on the audit, showing no new fraud. The land dispute was behind me, but Elaine's letter lingered in my mind. I sensed this wasn't the end. For now, though, I had the oak, the greenhouse, and a fresh start. That was enough. A year after Corinne's sentencing, the scars on my grandfather's oak had softened, new bark knitting over the crude HOA carving. The greenhouse hummed with life, tomato vines curling up trellises, lavender buzzing with bees. Pixel darted through the fields, her paw long-heeled, chasing scents along the creek now free of Corinne's gate. The land felt like mine again, but the past had a way of circling back. When Elaine Castor's letter arrived, claiming a right-of-way across my property, I knew Corinne's shadow hadn't faded entirely. Elaine's letter was a carbon copy of Corinne's tactics, bold, vague, and reeking of entitlement. She claimed to be Corinne's cousin and heir, insisting a private deed granted her access to the creek cutting through the Oaks Corner. The implication was clear. She wanted to reopen the easement fight, maybe force a settlement. I'd seen this play before. I called Elliot, my lawyer, who pulled the county records in hours. No deed existed. My 1998 survey and title were bulletproof. Still, Elaine's audacity meant she wouldn't back down without a fight. I invited her to my house, curious to size her up. She arrived in a polished sedan, her platinum blonde hair a deliberate echo of Corinne's. Over coffee, I let her spin her story. Corinne signed the deed before prison, she said, clutching a manila folder but offering no documents. It's my right to cross your land. Her eyes flicked to the oak outside, its branches swaying in the breeze. I smiled, keeping my tone light. Show me the deed and we'll talk. Elliot joined via Zoom, his face calm but his questions sharp. He presented the survey title and a notarized affidavit from Nora Beltran, my surveyor, confirming the property lines. There's no record of your deed, Ms. Castor, he said. If it's real, produce it. If it's forged, you're looking at felony charges. Elaine's confidence cracked. She stammered about misplaced paperwork and left, promising to consult her attorney. 2 days later, she withdrew her claim, canceling a scheduled court hearing. Elliot suspected she'd fabricated the deed, hoping I'd pay to avoid a legal hassle. It was a desperate move, and it failed. The victory was quiet but satisfying. Restitution checks from the state's victim fund started arriving, Corinne's prison wages garnished at $58 a month. It'd take decades to cover the $32,000 she owed me or the $46,900 owed to the HOA, but each check was a reminder of justice served. Chandler, still incarcerated, sent an unexpected letter. He'd earned a paralegal certificate in prison and wrote a halting apology for his role in the vandalism and fraud. Enclosed was a hand-drawn map suggesting spots for an orchard near the oak. "I know it doesn't fix things," he wrote, "but I'm trying." I was skeptical but wrote back, mentioning the greenhouse's first tomatoes and the oak's new leaves. No promises, but it felt like a door left ajar. Then came the real surprise. Sprout Tomorrow, an organic farming nonprofit, bought Karen's property at auction. Her house, once a hub of HOA scheming, was slated to become a community garden. Their director, Maya Chen, reached out, inviting me to consult on planting native pollinators. The irony wasn't lost on me. Karen's land, used to control and divide, would now nourish the neighborhood. I agreed, partly for the oak, partly to see her legacy undone. On Sprout Tomorrow's first volunteer day, I brought my brush cutter and a cooler of water. Deputy Rogers showed up, trading his badge for work gloves, hauling compost with a grin. Linda Tran, the HOA's new chair, joined too, along with neighbors I'd barely spoken to during the dispute. We tore out Karen's manicured lawn, replacing it with raised beds, milkweed, and sunflowers. I suggested a pollinator strip near the oak, where bees from my hives could thrive. Maya sketched a plan for tomato vines and squash, tying the garden to my greenhouse's crops. The air smelled of fresh earth and sweat, laughter cutting through the hum of shovels. As we worked, Rogers shared that Karen's prison term had been extended by 3 months for violating conduct rules. "She's not learning," he said, shaking his head. I didn't care. The oak loomed over us, its roots anchoring the land Karen had tried to steal. Pixel napped in its shade, tail twitching as bees danced nearby. Linda apologized again for the HOA's past, but I waved it off. "This is better," I said, nodding at the garden. "This is enough." By dusk, the beds were planted, and Maya thanked me with a jar of local honey. I walked home, passing the oak, its leaves catching the last light. Chandler's orchard sketch came to mind. Maybe I'd plant a few apple trees next spring. The greenhouse glowed softly, tomatoes ripening inside. The creek babbled, free of rebar and lies. Karen's schemes had come full circle, her land transformed into something good. I'd protected the oak, the bees, and the life I'd built. For the first time in years, the future felt as solid as the tree's roots. October's chill settled over the land, but the warmth of the season's end lingered under my grandfather's oak. Its leaves, gold and crimson, rustled above the greenhouse, where tomatoes hung heavy and lavender scented the air. The creek flowed freely, no longer choked by Karen's rebar gate, and Pixel bounded through the fields, her paw a distant memory of the nailboard. The battles of the past, Karen's schemes, Chandler's fraud, Elaine's forged deed, had faded, replaced by something new. Sprout Tomorrow's garden, thriving on Karen's former property, was proof of that. As I walked the land, I felt a quiet closure, but the story wasn't over. It was time to move forward. Sprout Tomorrow hosted a harvest dinner to celebrate the garden's first yield. They set long tables on what used to be Karen's lawn, now a patchwork of raised beds and pollinator strips. Neighbors gathered, some familiar from the HOA fight, others new, drawn by the nonprofit's mission. Maya Chen, the director, welcomed everyone, her voice carrying over the clink of mason jars and plates. The menu was simple but vibrant: roasted butternut squash, honey-glazed carrots drizzled with my bee's harvest, and heirloom tomato bruschetta, the tomatoes grown steps from my greenhouse. Every bite came from the soil we'd reclaimed, a middle finger to Karen's legacy of control. Maya raised a glass to me, calling me the guardian of the oak for stopping Karen's land grab. The crowd clapped, but I shrugged, uncomfortable with the spotlight. "The real win is this," I said, gesturing to the garden, the oak shadow stretching across the beds. "This is what matters." Linda Tran, the HOA's new chair, nodded from her seat, her earlier apologies now backed by action. The HOA had donated compost and tools to Sprout Tomorrow, a small atonement for past failures. Deputy Rogers, off-duty in flannel, caught my eye and grinned. He'd been at the volunteer day, hauling mulch, and now he was here, eating carrots like they were a personal victory. After dinner, I wandered to the oak, its trunk solid under my hand. The HOA carving was barely visible, a faint ripple beneath new bark. I thought of Grandpa, who'd planted the tree in 1965, his hands rough from years of tending this land. He taught me to fight for what's yours, not with anger, but with roots deep, unyielding ones. Karen had tried to uproot that legacy, but she'd failed. The oak stood, and so closure came in pieces. Restitution checks from Karen's prison wages arrived monthly, $58, a drop in the $32,000 she owed me, but a steady reminder of her defeat. The HOA's $46,900 was trickling in too, funding the audit that kept the board honest. Chandler's letter, with its orchard sketch and halting apology, sat on my desk. I hadn't planted his apple trees yet, but I'd written back, telling him the oak was thriving. His paralegal certificate was a start, and I wasn't one to hold grudges forever. Elaine Castor's forged deed, the last gasp of Corinne's influence, had collapsed before it could take root. Elliot's swift work had buried it, and Elaine hadn't been heard from since. The final piece was the barn. Using reclaimed wood from Corinne's dismantled gate and fence, I built it beside the greenhouse, with a proper county permit pinned proudly to the frame. It was small but sturdy, with a slanted roof to catch rainwater for the garden. Inside, I stored tools, beehive frames, and a few of Grandpa's old sketches, yellowed but preserved. The barn wasn't just shelter, it was a monument to everything we'd overcome. Pixel loved it, curling up in the straw while I worked, her tail thumping like a metronome. Moving forward meant embracing the land's new rhythm. The greenhouse yielded enough tomatoes and basil to share with Sprout tomorrow, and my bees' honey was a hit at the dinner. I started planning the orchard Chandler suggested, marking spots near the oak for dwarf apple trees. Maya and I talked about linking our gardens, maybe hosting a farmer's market next summer. The HOA under Linda's watch was quieter now, focused on sidewalks and streetlights, not power grabs. Rogers dropped by occasionally, less as a deputy, more as a neighbor, always with a story about some petty call that paled next to Corinne's saga. One evening, I sat under the oak, Pixel at my side, watching the creek reflect the sunset. The air smelled of earth and possibility. I thought of Grandpa's lessons, the way he'd point to the oak and say, "It's not just a tree, it's a promise." I'd kept that promise through cameras, surveys, and courtrooms. Corinne's greed, Chandler's weakness, Elaine's lies, they'd all crumbled against it. The garden, the barn, the bees, they were my promise back to the land and to myself. As winter loomed, I hung a lantern in the barn, its glow spilling across the greenhouse. Pixel barked at a passing deer, and I laughed, the sound carrying over the creek. The oak's branches swayed, leaves falling like quiet applause. We'd earned this peace, and I'd guard it, not with fences, but with roots deep, unyielding, and alive.